Good afternoon, good evening, everyone, to our fourth lecture in a series of 5 on agroecology and the transition to sustainable food systems. My name is Martin Sonneveld. I'm the director of the World Food System Center. And as in the last weeks, I'm very happy that we have 2 inspiring speakers with us tonight, also to talk about an additional principle of agroecology. We'll talk about fairness today, but before I hand over to Johanna Jacobi and then Loredana Sorg, please let me introduce quickly our public lecture. Those who have been with us earlier, you know what comes now. We will have 2 inputs from 2 experts sharing their experiences from their work, from different contexts also tonight, and how their work connects to agroecology and the principle fairness for today. After these 2 presentations, we will have a moderated Q&A session, and afterwards the public part is ending, and then the 2 speakers will interact with the students which are enrolled in this course afterwards. So it's then probably also, of course, possible to ask questions. You can directly ask your questions at the end of the 2 presentations, or if you prefer, you can also use the chat function to start interacting with the speakers or among each other. A few words on sustainable food systems. We all know that global society gave itself with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, a direction of how development around the globe should be addressed with these 17 SDGs, which are all very closely linked to the food system. We have kind of a guideline, a grid, which allows us to also deal with many trade-offs we face when we talk about sustainable food systems, addressing at one hand food and nutrition security, on the other hand human and environmental health, but then also livelihoods and well-being of food system actors such as farmers, but also people working in processing food or delivering food to then, of course, consumers, which are also an important part of the food system. Agroecology has a strong role in food system transformation. That's at one side because of its definition, the threefold definition being a science, a set of practices for sustainable agricultural practices, and also a social movement. It opens and spans, hence, kind of many different elements where the agro-ecosystem connects also with social systems at different levels, from farm level all the way down to the food system level. And that's where these 13 principles of agroecology are an important guideline and basis for us to seek for possibilities to support sustainable food system transformation. They address both the agroecosystem. We had, for example, last time we talked about recycling. That's more a principle addressing more the agroecosystem at the farm level. But also there, we learned that many of the recycling elements do span also into other food system elements. And it does also entail principles which do directly address the food system at large. As our topic of today, fairness, where it is about supporting dignified and robust livelihoods for all actors engaged in food systems, especially, of course, small-scale food producers. And that's then the basis of fair trade, fair employment, and fair treatment, also of intellectual property rights. That's what kind of all is encapsulated in the principle fairness. And those who have been here, you also know that it is the question then also, when we talk about transformation, we can talk about incremental steps, That's what also is referred to, let's say, level 1 and 2, if we talk about agroecology, element principles which address the farm level, but it goes all the way up to societal level, food system level, where the question is, how can agroecology support building a new global food system based on important principles such as participation, localness, fairness again, and justice. So this graph helps us always a bit to find our position. Where are we in the discussion when we talk about agroecology? Because it's so holistic, we need to, this helps us a bit to also place ourselves in the discussion of agroecology. We are now here, point 4, lecture 4. We have Loredana Sorg. She's co-head development project and member of the executive committee of BioVision Foundation here in Switzerland. And we have Johanna Jacobi with us. She's assistant professor of agroecological transitions here at ETH Zurich. And it's a great pleasure to have you both with us tonight, this afternoon. And it would be a pleasure now if you, Johanna, could take over the screen, quickly introduce yourself, and then share your thoughts on agroecology and fairness with us. Thank you for being with us tonight. Johanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin, and to the World Food System Center for creating this space. I hope you can see my screen. Can someone quickly tell me if this is okay?
We see it nicely and perfectly.
Good. So, yes, I work on agroecological transition, which means transformation research. I focus on political ecology and power relations and food systems. So that's why I'm very honored to talk about the fairness principle in agroecology today. If we look at the 10 elements of agroecology and how fairness is defined in the HLPE report in agroecology, you can see that it talks about, here on the left, local needs, short food circuits, and fair prices for producers and consumers. This is all very important, but I must say it remains rather vague, and it does not really define also what is not fair or no-goes. And in the FAO definition on the right, it is not specifically or explicitly mentioned. So I would say it kind of points also to a coexistence with other models of food systems, non-agroecological models. But then we can wonder if that is actually possible. So because there are models that may render any fairness impossible, for instance, an export market orientation or land grabbing or wind pollinating transgenics or pesticide drift. So I want to look at what's actually unfair in the food system for a minute. So we can start with this. Those who stand up for nature and for local communities are being murdered at devastating numbers. So only in 2021, 200 environmental defenders and indigenous leaders were killed. And the top 5 countries are Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and Philippines and Nicaragua. And their crime was to oppose land grabbing, mega development projects, and very often agribusinesses. So behind this industrial growth logic in agriculture are some historical economists such as Thomas Malthus and such theories as his on population growth and food production, which is actually more than 200 years old. And he said that populations grow exponentially, while food production only grows in a linear way, and at some point there will not be enough food for everyone. And this doesn't actually have a scientific basis, because production is today almost 6,000 kilocalories per person per day, and populations don't grow exponentially. And it's also not accounted for. Poverty is not included, and overconsumption by some populations. But still, this narrative was repeated in the Club of Rome, in the Limits of Growth, and Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb, and it still serves as an argument for input-intensive industrial agriculture until today. And it implies some really problematic messages. For example, for Malthus, famine and starvation were essential to controlling human populations. They were natural and inevitable. And he then questioned the UK support to feed the poor, because he said that this is actually counter-environmental. And any policy to help the poor were then seen as the source and not the solution of the misery. And the reason of poverty, he said, was among the poor themselves. So here, this quotation here that in searching for objects of accusation, the poor man never adverts to the quarter from which all his misfortunes originate. The last person he would think of accusing is himself, on whom in fact the whole blame lies. So it's blaming the poor, basically, where we can say from our state of knowledge now, it's elsewhere. We can say, we can question really the industrial paradigm of food production, because it really sees humans and nature as inputs in the production system. And capital and corporations are, of course, at the center of this model. And the paradigm of industrial agriculture is also, we can say, rooted in war, because it very literally uses the same chemicals that were once used to exterminate people, to destroy nature, no? And a food system that's governed by this law of exploitation and of domination harms people's health and the environment. And these tools then are often toxic substances that are marketed as agrochemicals, and we are told that farming is not possible without them. But it's in reality the corporations that make these chemicals that are shaping the paradigms of possibility. So they shape or they define what constitutes scientific knowledge, what an efficient food production system looks like, and also what the boundaries of research and trade should be. And this development is then also seen as desirable. So it's assumed that the others, like women or non-white people or underdeveloped countries or peasants, will also reach this with more effort and more education and more investment. But catching up development, how this is sometimes called, is actually a myth, because it has nowhere really led to desired goals. Rather, the lack of development is actually the direct consequence of overconsumption by rich industrial countries. And we can also say that colonial power today involves the externalization of costs of the system. So the damages linked to that overconsumption has been shifted to those countries' environments and also to their peoples. So some from my own research, some results. So we looked at these narratives here in a research project in Kenya, that only export-oriented agriculture will enhance sustainable development, like convincing governments with promises of job creation and GDP increase is a very strong argument there. Also then creating support structures that promote only one model. And we found that looking at vegetable farms near Mount Kenya, that they produce mainly beans and spinach and broccoli and other greens for Europe instead of local food. And we found that in a big survey that only 5% of the surrounding households actually had a family member working in those systems in the last 12 months, which is not as high as we maybe expect when there's a lot of promise of job creation. And then also, if we look at the price, at the value generated on the value chain, up to 67% of the final price actually stayed in the supermarket in Europe, and very little stayed in Kenya. And then also there was a very big energy inefficiency. So we found that there were 39 calories used to just produce 1 food calorie. We then looked it up for Switzerland, but there's also inefficient. We use more than 2 calories to produce 1 calorie in the food system, but not as much as this one. So, and then also the extension services around this, fertilizer subsidies, the credits are mainly there for the agro-industrial export model. So these were some findings underlining this unfairness in the food system. But of course, there are lots of food movements organizing that demand and also live this change that they see as necessary to overcome this unfairness that's inherent in today's food system. So there are anti-racist, eco-feminist, post-capitalist, abolitionist, and other movements that relate, I would say, more to justice than just fairness. We also have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants that I think 119 countries have undersigned. Then also food sovereignty that that prioritizes local production and the rights and participation of peoples. And paradigm change, of course, requires visions and examples. So that's why also I focus on these alternatives in my research. We now look at fairness that's in definitions of agroecology. I like the definition of Sitte, but if you look at this, how fairness is involved there, we can see that this is all about the local food system. So this is really not about feeding the pulpwood industry or feeding the feed industry, like in what I showed before. It's not about productivity per se, but food production for healthy and local communities, no? And this is very important and has led to the idea of food sovereignty, to which agroecology contributes. But with the power relations in our current food systems that concentrate a lot of power in very few hands, it's impossible, I would say, because land and water and seeds are taken away and environmental defenders, as we have seen, are killed. So one way to overcome the situation, if we have this hourglass model here, where we have many producers and many consumers and few actors in between that concentrate the power, is to build the alternatives here, shown as a bypass here in this model by Van der Ploeg from Wageningen, by more directly linking producers and consumers through, for example, farmers markets or community-supported agriculture or farmer-owned or employee-owned companies. There are many, many examples for this. So that means that power is less concentrated with few actors, and therefore this is about a democratization of the food system. And only then we can really realize this potential of agroecology, I would say. This is why agroecology is very, very political. So one example are the many CSAs, community supported agriculture. Here's a new handbook about this concept in German for free to download. And in CSAs, consumers are committing for the whole year, and they don't buy a product, but they buy a share of the harvest. And therefore the producers can share the risk of production with the consumers and have some kind of planning security. And very importantly, there's no overproduction like in conventional patterns. So here's some principles of CSAs that are mentioned in this handbook. So we have multifunctionality instead of one-sided efficiency. We have ecological and social added value. We have individual resilience for the consumer. We have democratic and participatory governance. We have proximity between producers and consumers against alienation, which is a big problem in our food system, and food waste. Then the concept of prosumers that actively shape the CSAs. So it's not just, we are not disempowered consumers that can just vote with their ballot. We can become prosumers, we can change roles, we can learn and understand more. It's about meaningful work and agency in times of converging crisis, the climate crisis, biodiversity, health crisis, financial crisis, as we see in these days also again. Then regional resilient supply structures that are compatible with eco-friendly technologies. It's a structural independence from growth, which is maybe the most interesting or one of the most interesting aspects of CSAs. Distributional justice through many small producers and job creation instead of one actor growing. Also cooperation instead of competition at many levels. So I think all these are very, very important factors. Again, from my own research in Bolivia, there are also examples of CSAs here in the case of Probioma. So this is coming up in many, many countries. But I want to go one step further. So if we want solidarity economy to flourish, we also have to know what exactly it is that we need to overcome in the food system. So these reductionist views of the food system are very blind to ecological and social and epistemic disruptions in our food systems. And that makes that has the consequence that no systemic change is actually possible. So the capitalist functioning, the systemic racism, the intersectionality are really root causes for hunger and malnutrition, and also ecocide, we can say, in the food system. No? One example is the industrial meat regime with the concentrated animal feeding operations, the CAFOs, that exploit land and animals and people. So an agroecology can really be used to mend this social, ecological, metabolic rift that traces back, as some argue, from colonial slavery until today. And this has been called abolitionist agroecology, that I find very interesting. So what is it that we don't want anymore, what we cannot afford anymore, not accept anymore? So that means to really abolish oppression, farmers, and to gain back farmers' control over their own production, find pathways to revive traditional knowledge and use scientifically robust science to produce food in healthy and ecological sound ways. No? And as agroecology is principally dependent on biodiversity, it can really provide migrating wildlife with forage or nesting sites or chemical-free corridors and other elements of a matrix through which the organisms are likely to successfully travel. And this has been called nature's metrics. This is why I put this book here. But it must also help to heal social and epistemic rift with lessons from abolition, as I argue, or building on other authors here. So the systemic exploitation of food workers and especially also women. So some lessons that can be drawn from the anti-slavery movement are that foundational structures of organizing social life can be changed, right? That reform is not enough. K-12 are and will be always a source of violence and disease and environmental degradation. Then abolition is not merely a negative strategy. It's also very important that this is about not just abolishing something, but about building life-affirming institutions, also reimagining the world, building on Angela Davis here. Then also it's about building solidarity and fairness, which I thought is important. And it's very much about the land. It always comes back, what happens on the land, on the territories. So what I also want to say is that the importance of feminism in agroecology. So there are even UN reports that say there is no agroecology without feminism, building, of course, on the social movement. So this doesn't come from the governments, but from the social movements that claim their space. And so this is, again, going one step further, maybe. So we can see that, of course, we know that women are central to feeding the world, but they are also systematically exploited. Women are seed keepers, they're domesticators of plants and breeds, they are guardians of diversity. And agroecology really takes into account this interconnectedness of life and the complex processes that take place within nature. And here there's also a definition of how agroecology takes into account the women's situation. And it says that agroecology has links with feminism with many and through many dimensions. For example, it creates meaningful work by integrating diverse working tasks and specific knowledge, and also by providing diversified roles for women in the household economy, while then also changing patriarchal structures inside the family unit and in the working environment. And then it can help with social coherence and women's collective and creative work, for example, through women-only spaces where women can strengthen creative and collective work towards self-determination. Then also agroecology fosters better economic opportunities for women because it's less risky and more affordable and more accessible for women than industrial or input-intensive agriculture. And then agroecology supports the health of both the agricultural workers and the consumers because it eliminates the harmful synthetic chemicals, which have or women are more affected by pesticides than men because, of course, often they clean the clothes and the tools and so on. So there are studies that show that. Then agroecology supports biodiversity and traditional knowledge, and very strongly the political dimension. So it's not enough to simply include women in the implementation of actions. Actually, women need to be there from the outset, designing them. And it's not about increasing women's options within the recognized economy, but rather about generating new solidarity economy pathways where the productive and the reproductive work is made visible and shared. So now if you want to dive deeper, I wanted to share some podcasts, videos, and literature that might give more insight into those topics that I just very quickly mentioned. And with that, I am at the end for this. Here's some impressions of how feminism and agroecology come together to underline this struggle for justice that's more than about fairness, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johanna, for this more science-based input on agroecology and fairness. Thank you very much for this impressive overview. And now from science, probably more to practice. Loredana, I'm happily handing over to you.
Thank you very much. So, warm welcome also from my side. I'm glad that I can contribute something to this lecture series, and I will come to that later in my presentation. But as you will see, we are with BioVision, we are really focused on development projects in East Africa as one of our programs. So I will talk about the fairness in food system transformation with concrete examples from our work. And now, Jan, oops, perfect. Thank you. Jan is helping me with the technique. I'm currently in Nairobi, so I didn't have all the facilities here. Then in the next 20 or I hope 15 minutes, I will talk about what we understand on the fairness beyond the principle 10 that you already have seen before. And of course, a lot of that has already been covered by Johanna from a scientific point of view now. Then I want to talk about some practical examples from East Africa. And I would also like, maybe then, especially for the discussion that follows, to question our work a little bit. Well, I can skip this one because you all are aware that we are talking about the principle 10, fairness. But what is, maybe going a bit deeper is that the agroecology is actually based on this bottom-up and territorial processes, on solutions with people at the center, on real needs of the ones that are actually implementing agroecology, and that localized problem finding is very important. So we do not rely on state-of-the-art recipe solutions. We also try to include marginalized groups. So this is the leave no one behind approach, and fair access to resources for all is a basic principle. But having said all that, it's still a big question, who actually decides what is fair? Because it might still be a very much Europe-centered view of fairness. So in practice, we actually face quite some challenges. It's us, now in this case, BioVision, who has great ideas and principles, but we actually only want to work with projects or with partners that are going into the same direction. This is transforming the food systems through agroecology. We have a lot of other actors coming into the play. It might be country strategies or private sector actors. Just there are a lot of others with their perspective of fairness. We have our project partners and our participants of the projects in East Africa, and all of us have plans and ideas where we want to go. So we actually have to balance all these aspirations, or all these expectations of how to fairly distribute the benefits. Very shortly about BioVision, I think not all of you know us. We are a foundation based in Switzerland working on sustainable development, and our holistic approach to agroecological transformation is really based on all aspects of agriculture. So we have plant health, animal health, and environmental health, where we try to develop and disseminate new solutions. What I will be talking about today is mainly our field of action for food security and sustainable use of natural resources, so agroecological transformation in East Africa. We also have policy and advocacy on a global level and on a country level in East Africa again. And we do have projects and programs running in Switzerland, which would be very interesting regarding fairness as well, but I won't talk about those today. So Johanna already talked about Kenya before, and I will go back with you first to Tanzania and then on a very short visit to Kenya as well. Now, the first example of fairness in practice is with the vision of a fair business model or value chains for small-scale farmers to participate in marketing of organic produce. That's not very creative, I admit. The approach of centralized processing and then including cooperatives in the value addition process actually might not be the newest one either, but what is really special about that approach is that it grows from the cooperatives themselves. So it was first the farmer groups actually who built and were strengthened, and then they decided to participate in the processing and in the marketing of their produce. And as Johanna already explained very nicely before, it's not about export. So some spices are exported. This is of course up to the cooperatives and up to our partner organization. But the main market is the local market with vegetables and milk products. So the founder of the organization I will be talking about actually quite proudly said, we are thinking of a special business model that is quite certainly still unique in the world, but could be suitable for setting up agroecological value chains in Africa. So our project partner who is implementing this project is Sustainable Agriculture Tanzania. They do have an NGO, but they also founded a social enterprise with the vision of transforming agriculture, markets, and communities. So again, it's going further than just creating value for the export market. For this model or for this system, you need the producers. So in this case, these are the vegetable farmers in the Uluguru Mountains in Morogoro in Tanzania, and the pastoralists, Maasai pastoralists, producing now hay bales for off-season milk production so that they really can participate in processing. Then you have the cooperatives. They actually had to go through a lot of steps to be able to act on their own. There was a high illiteracy rate. Yeah, they had a lot of structures to build, but they were really motivated to go that way. And you have the NGO SAT, who actually has the processing facilities at their farmer training center. And you have the SAT Holistic Group, this social enterprise who is responsible for running the business and the marketing. Now, BioVision support, we are working with that NGO for a long time, but in this special case, we supported the NGO in buying additional equipment for processing, since they needed some injection of capital in the beginning. And they transferred it to the enterprise, who then transfers the equivalent of this value of the equipment that we bought for them to shares for the enterprise for farmers and pastoralists. So the farmers and pastoralists are owners of the company. And if the whole process is finalized, the producers will actually be the largest shareholder in this social enterprise. The benefits are many, but what might be interesting in this case is that the producers get access to a good agroecological market locally and to some parts also for export. They participate in the development of the company. It's really a very unhierarchical horizontal structures. They have no maintenance cost of the facility, and they even get dividends in case the business is running. So they are really responsible for the success. For the cooperatives, it's an efficient way to grow because they do not have high costs of operational management, and very often this is actually what is a difficult, or like a barrier for cooperatives to grow if they have to invest too much in their operational management. And for the company, it's a great opportunity to increase their capital, because it's very difficult for small enterprises to get to capital. Actually, the big ones, they usually don't have problem finding investors, but the smaller ones is quite difficult actually to access any starting capital. And just to make it a bit more complicated again, there are of course a lot of other agroecological principles covered in that approach as well. You might be, or you might already have talked about them, but the economic diversification aspect, or the co-creation of knowledge, so that they really also go on learning journeys together, the cooperatives with the employees of the processing facility. It's quite a holistic approach that we hope we will learn from a lot. So it's again the founder who is very proud of that approach. He said to me, well, it's hard to believe, but it's really a win-win-win story. And we hope that we can report on this win-win-win soon. So the second example that will be a bit shorter, because it's actually a project that just will start in April, 1st of April, but we have been discussing and working on it for a long time with the consortium. It's a project in Kenya that wants to pilot an organic food system by connecting vulnerable consumers in Nairobi with small-scale producers in Makueni County. So it is quite a risky or quite a courageous thing to do, because the aim is really to provide organic food for slum people, for inhabitants of the slums in Nairobi, because the idea is that they have a right to healthy food as well. And actually the demand is quite high. The problem is, of course, access and price. So the idea is to produce it at lower costs and with more direct linkages to the producers. The nice idea behind is that the picture you see here, this was actually taken by my colleague 2 days ago. He visited the field. That here in Makueni County, most of the people now living in this target slum, they originally come from that region in Makueni. So they actually already have sort of a linkage, but it is not used commercially, or it's not really working for food yet. But this is the idea. And the system, I first come to the vision. So it's really the vision to have a regional, healthy, inclusive and regenerative food system within the dominant food system in Kenya. So dominant food system might relate again to that graph that Johanna showed you before with the agri-food empires as a concentration of power. So it's actually showing a different approach within the dominant food system in Kenya. And the approach is to test different market linkages and business models and to generate evidence on alternative food systems. And this one I already said. So actually the picture you see here, the difference between 5th of October to 5th of November last year, it's taken by our partner organization Feedback to the Future, who also works on rooftop gardens in the slums. And they have quite a success with this very local vegetable production. Now, the model in practice, it's our partner Feedback to the Future working with the farmers in Makueni. Then it's also Feedback to the Future and our other partner organization, Diabetes Awareness Trust. So it's a diabetes organization that really wants to foster healthy food. They work in the slums in Nairobi. And we have now the challenge to link the two. But while doing so, we also work with Biodiversity International, who has some experience in local urban food systems, and who will do the research part of it, because we really want to learn from that. Either it works, that would be perfect, or if it doesn't work, we at least want to know exactly why it didn't work and hopefully do it better next time. Again, it's not only about fairness, there are a lot of other agroecological principles linked to this. So for BioVision, to sum it up, for BioVision, the approach to fairness is focus on initiatives and needs of local communities, not with a primary focus on expert, but possible if meaningful, strengthening and autonomization of local actors, and to use participatory project development and shared responsibilities with as many groups as possible. It's not always possible because it gets very complicated, but we try that. And sorry, I skipped the last point, but I will come back to that. One very important aspect or factor in practice is expectation management, because these projects sound great, but then you have to manage expectations of everyone involved, so people don't get disappointed if it doesn't work within the first 2 or 3 months. Of course, there are some challenges. For example, I talked before about providing healthy food for the local population, but of course, I sometimes ask myself, who am I to tell the partner organization or the farmer groups to produce for the local market if they could potentially benefit in the it's usually short term, but if they could maximize their short-term income from export. So you have to weigh the healthy nutrition of the local population versus maximizing income for farmers. Of course, in the end, if the agroecological principles or agroecological system is really implemented in the long run, both should benefit from localized systems. And what I said what I mentioned right in the beginning, the decision power is still one-sided. I mean, we have our principles. We are not free to fund anything. So even if the communities tell us something great, but it's just really not in BioVision's statutes and principles, we cannot fund it. For example, this refers now to the failures. Well, failures. Yeah, it was a bit of a failure. in early times with yet another project. We worked on eco-cultural mapping. So the communities mapped their past, their present, and where they want to go. And the idea is actually to define with them on their initiative a way to protect natural resources and to farm more sustainably. However, what they actually draw for the future was an airport and a highway close to their village. And of course, BioVision couldn't really support them in achieving these goals. So this is always this trade-off. And I think, again, that's why the expectation management is so important. Now, I will skip that one because that would be a completely different story. So I just want to come back to what I said in the beginning. All these different perspectives that have to be weighed against each other and that have to be balanced. It's still the question who decides what is weighed and what balance is where. But I think it all comes down to, I read that somewhere, that fairness actually is to care about the needs of others. And as long as all the actors involved in the system care about the needs of others, it's most probably possible to find a solution going into that way. And that's also, again, very much linked to agroecology. If everyone plays their role, science, politics, development agents, and practitioners, it's possible to set up such systems and to create greater benefit for all. So I thank you very much.
And so do we. Thank you very much, Loredana and Johanna, for sharing your perspectives. And it's a nice combination of different viewpoints, and that's why I'm so glad to have you both from your different viewpoints and sharing these very honest and powerful inputs with us. Without any further ado, it's really about opening the microphones for questions to both Johanna and Loredana. I suggest we go one by one, but maybe let's see how the discussion flows. There is also some interaction on the chat, so try to survey both. But anyone who has a question, please open your mic and maybe quickly introduce yourself and then ask your questions.
There were some questions in the chat. I don't know if we should maybe start with that.
Yeah, let's start with that. That was a question to you, right? In terms of, in the context of greenwashing, the question.
So I understand that this is a question to all of us probably about co-optation of agroecology or regenerative or sustainability in general. I think that's important to discuss. I mean, I can say what I think and then maybe others have other views on that, but I think that's a quite important question because agroecology is now, it's fashionable and everyone talks about it, as well as happened with sustainability and other terms. So how can we defend the content against being emptied, no? What I think is really that we really have to see if all the principles are included, not just one or two, cannot just be about efficiency, for example. It really also needs to be about all the others. And one that is especially powerful is participation. And and the bottom-up possibilities to shape the food system that goes into the direction of food sovereignty. And I think that really helps us to distinguish. For example, there has been this report about junk agroecology, right? That says that corporate agroecology that doesn't really change the problem and comes top down is palatable to everyone, but doesn't really change anything. So I think there they have some indications of what we can look at if you want to know if it's really transformative and if it really looks at all the principles or just like one or two. I would say these are maybe some hints that could help, but maybe the others have others too.
Loredana, do you want to add on?
Yeah, maybe just to add, I think for our work, it's usually the bound. I mean, we also, of course, collaborate with private sector actors for providing input, because usually you just need a system an economic system that is also providing inputs, at least as long as we do have the current market system. But what is that sort of the boundary is the question of dependency. So as soon as these enterprises or big actors are creating dependencies, it doesn't work anymore. And I think this is also really inherent to agroecology. It's about strengthening the autonomy of actors and increasing their decision power and giving them choices to really choose what fits best for their solution or for their situation. And that's why, of course, it's difficult to counter these greenwashing attempts of the big enterprises, of the big agroecological of the big agrochemicals. But I think the boundary is there. Dependency or autonomization is probably what decides also.
Participation, dependency, being honest about the level in terms of, do we talk about incremental steps or do we talk about real food system transformation? I guess that's for me too. These are elements which are very important to clarify when we talk about agroecology or whatever we want to call these sustainable steps. It needs to be very clear what we are talking about, and that helps then also to enter into a discussion which is definitely needed with all actors involved. This question is open for you to share your thoughts, but in the meantime, Cecilia had also a question. It's probably related to what you already mentioned in the chat, but please, Cecilia.
Hello, can you hear me?
We hear you clear.
Oh, great. My name is Cecilia Gonzalez, and I am a co-leader of a community of practice called the Agriculture Nutrition Community of Practice. I'm based in Baltimore, Maryland in the US, and I'm originally from Ecuador. So my question on the connection between agroecology and food systems is like, since we're talking about systemic change, what do you think about governance? Like, how can we achieve more agroecological practices within the food systems through better governance? And then the second one is also particularly to what Loredana was saying about some of the trade-offs or shortcomings when it comes to power balance, achieving more equity. How can we maybe give up some of the power that people have based on nationality or access to financial resources? Because I know I was listening to a podcast on biases and how we have all these different biases, and so I think when it comes to prioritizing what a community would like to do, we would have probably disagreements on what is important or not. How do we lay down some of our power to prioritize more of what communities want to do, and so that there is, they also have more agency in deciding.
Loredana, please.
Yeah, I think one approach that more and more development actors are trying to take, not to the same degree of success, but it's really to coordinate our work and to sit at a table together. It's sort of a landscape approach, but going beyond the landscape, because if you are really joining forces, then you can you can't work on probably on all the needs of the communities, but you can give much more freedom in them choosing what they want to work on first, or giving them the possibility to show initiative. If you are not just one development actor, but actually you bring different expertise and also different back donors. I mean, we are of course also a bit dependent on who provides the money to us. So I think this is one way of really joining forces, because then you can rather reply to the needs of the communities. And then what is of course the first step, and I think this is or should be, and I think here at least it is state of the art in almost all the development projects, that first of all you have community development plans, or it's a lot of capacity building within the communities before you even start with any intervention. So that actually the first step is to empower them to decide what they want. And once they are at that step, they still can decide, do they want to work with you on agroecology, or do they want to go into contract farming with a big agro-multi company? Because it's really up to them. So I think this is first doing the capacity building and then starting the interventions and joining forces of different actors, but still overcoming the as you said, this power imbalance in the current system. It's very difficult, and again, of course, this asks for a transformation of the system, because as long as the development agents provide the money, and they are always these funds are always linked or attached to certain principles, this power imbalance is just there. So, and then of course, so far the approaches of just giving money free to anyone is almost always ending in corruption, which would be the same for us, of course, if it wasn't regulated by the state. So yeah, it's quite difficult to completely to completely get rid of all these imbalances. But I think the first step, or besides what I said before, the very important steps are to acknowledge that there are power imbalances, to show them very clearly, and to actually not just say everything is fair and nice, because as soon as they are on the table, it's also easier to give choices to someone. And well, I really wished that we managed to go to a step where we can give much more power to our partners, to the communities, and that we are able to deal with the consequences. Because right now we are the buffer between them, actually. And if we give more power and more decision power to the communities and the partners, we also need to be able to deal with the consequences, even though they might go completely the other direction than agroecology. So yeah, I don't have the solution, but I hope that we get quite some further in the next few years.
Maybe if I say something on the governance question that I find really important, also for my research, as I said, I try to do research on food democracy, and this is really about participation in the food system, and whose voices are heard and whose voices are not heard, and how to level the power asymmetries a bit. And there, the concept of deliberation is very important. I had last year the first Citizens' Assembly on food policy in Switzerland, where exactly that was tried out. What happens if you assign normal citizens with resolving a task, in this case, food policy? So there are positive examples from other countries where this was done for other topics, but it is really interesting to bring people who get together who don't have like a lobby interest in the topic, who just discuss the arguments and then make recommendations. And we could see that the discussions are totally different than when just the so-called experts and the lobby groups discuss, which is sometimes very, very stuck and doesn't really get over the problems. And of course, the idea of this is to develop the democracy further, instead of saying it's not working. We can see now in Switzerland, the agriculture policy, it's really, really very bad. It's very stuck. But this is not a reason, I would say, to say, okay, hey, then let's do it top down, but instead to do much more bottom up. And for that, of course, we need a lot more food literacy, how we call it. Like people understanding their food systems, connecting to the different parts of it. And I think there really also these bypasses that I showed are crucial. But we could do much more with school gardening and school kitchens, and really starting earlier with this food literacy by people producing their own food and processing it and so on. So there's so much that could be done. And this also in other countries. We can take examples from Brazil, from other countries in Latin America that I now know, but there are many, where we could network much more and really also do much more for a more democratic food system.
Thank you, Johanna. Loredana, this is linked to the question you just...
Yeah, actually, just to
Go
very
ahead,
briefly
and then
add on that,
Cyril.
because this is, I completely omitted the governance question, but this is also the reason why we in parallel work on this policy and advocacy level. And for example, in Kenya, we really work with county government, well, sometimes with the governments, and even more with multi-stakeholder platforms, where the idea is to really have different stakeholders, and you have also farmer representatives. Sometimes it's in the platform, sometimes it's in a different group, because it's very difficult to hear their voices if there are too many high-level people. But the idea is really, as Johanna said, also in Kenya or in our project countries, to support such initiatives of sharing ideas in the non-formal system, to get to more creative solutions and to be able to think outside of the box. But you always have to include somehow the decision makers. Otherwise, you never will get your solutions through. So it's always in collaboration with politicians or with the administration.
Thank you. Cyril, your question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks a lot for the very inspiring talks. I think it was wonderful. I also love the food literacy part, which is, I think, is very, very important. I was just wondering how do you defend agroecology as you presented it now against political attack? Because it includes many very sensitive, as for example, you, Johanna, presented it. It includes many kind of sensitive, triggering political topics, which kind of might undermine the scientific robustness of your research. Do you face that challenge at any time, and how do you confront it if so?
I'm not so sure if I understood it very clearly what you wanted to ask. In that case, you can correct me. But I did research. I lived in Bolivia for 6 years, and I did research in Brazil and other countries of Latin America. And there's a lot of science there in agroecology that very clearly directly looks at the alternatives and questions capitalism and the agri-food systems, and says, hey, we need different ways of looking at food, not as a commodity, but as a commons, right? So I think bringing it together from science internationally, this is not so conflictive, even as we see that our current epistemology that we use to do research on food systems is very, very limited in the Western world. So I see it as an enrichment to really say, hey, with our Western scientific materialistic worldview that's very reductionist in science, we cannot get where we need to get in food system transformation. So let's get inspired by other sciences and also by other forms of knowledge, like indigenous knowledge that really links in these kind of action research projects that I do with the so-called scientific knowledge. So it even questions who owns the knowledge and who creates how the truth, right? And I find this in transdisciplinary research, this is more common to think that way, where of course it clashes a bit, is like, let's say, more reductionist ways of doing science on the food system. But also there, I mean, the crises are so big and so clear that agroecology is a very nice way of bringing them together, where it touches about finance, it touches on land ownership and all this. And I think we have so many interesting examples from all over the world that this is not so hard to defend. I don't know if this answers your question, but yeah.
I think it does. I was just wondering, so if I would go out and talk to, I don't know, Schweizer Bauernverband or I don't know, whoever, other, like who might have a very different political view.
Yeah, I think it's always, yeah, sorry.
I mean, it will be discussions, but I just wondered whether you got blamed for being leftist or whatever, even though, I mean, I completely understand it's not, but I was just wondering whether you got confronted with something like that.
I think it's always a question of listening to each other, no? I mean, farmers have their concerns, and many of them are very, very understandable, because let's say, okay, the farmers they don't want to change what they do, yes, but look at the history, how they were for decades like pushed into the system, that now people want to change with an initiative. I mean, of course they are against this. So understanding a bit their background, listening to each other without like giving up your own what you know, right? I think that really helps a lot. I mean, yeah, it's not that we don't have a dialogue.
Thank you very much. This is also why we try to have this series with different perspectives and to share different perspectives. Nora, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me. So first of all, thank you so much for this really interesting presentation about fairness in agroecology. So my background is I worked with an orphan crop in Africa and was working also in microfinancing. So my question is, what can you do to that people are listening to you more, and it's like that people can see the importance that is given instead of like the lobby groups, for example? And do you think that there are external partners more needed? And yeah, what do you think we need to have a bigger change or to achieve this change maybe more easily? I don't know if my question made sense, but yeah.
Go ahead, whoever.
Yeah. Just because it is one very convincing example here, I think now in Kenya there is drought, actually quite a serious drought for the fifth season, so it's 2.5 years, and a lot. I mean, today there were riots in town because food prices were so high in Nairobi. I mean, all in the country, all around the country, but there were really heavy riots here, and it's just so obvious that the conventional solutions don't work anymore, because you can't produce food at the moment with just providing fertilizer and chemical inputs. It just doesn't work anymore, because the soils need to be restored, and it needs to be a different way of conserving the waters in the soil and reforestation. So it really becomes so obvious that agroecology has a chance to actually show evidence that agroecology, of course, it's not in the short term, but that agroecology is working and that agroecology has answers to these problems. I think in a quite luxury environment, it might be more difficult to advocate for a systems change, because you just could go on living. I mean, in Switzerland, we know about it, but we all feel we just could go on a bit like this and life would still be nice. While in other regions, sometimes really it just isn't nice anymore, and you have to change something. And I think in these cases now, people who are advocating for alternative agricultural, agroecological food systems, they are heard more and more. Of course, there are always enemies, but if you can provide evidence that is working, if you have enough people from all the levels, practitioners, consumers who are advocating for it, at least you're heard. It's not yet the majority, of course, but I think it will grow more and more. And you have, just to add, I mean, on a global level, after the Food Systems Summit, you also have a coalition on agroecology, where actually a lot of countries join, and they signed in that they are working towards agroecology. They are developing their strategies. So more and more also a legal framework for agroecology is being developed. And then it's easier to advocate for it, because you have the framework and you have something to refer to.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Johanna, you want to add something on this?
Yeah.
Before we close slowly?
Yes, maybe just to finish on this, I would say that it's very important to show the evidence, but also we have to demand to change more strongly from wherever we are in the food system. So from science, for example, we can think what we engage into. So for example, I'm part of Agroecology Works. That's an association in Switzerland that tries to be an amplifier for all the hundreds of agroecological initiatives that exist in Switzerland. No? So you can really also engage in different parts of the movement to strengthen it, and you can produce your own food, and you can, through this, demand the change and get more audience also, because as we are organizing, we're getting stronger. So this is, I think, a very important addition to just showing the evidence, because that has been done for decades also, and it hasn't really brought the change it should have. And yeah, we can take that lesson from climate sciences also.
Thank you, Isabel. Let's allow this last question, and then we slowly close this session. So Isabel, please.
Yeah.
last fast question.
Well, first of all, thank you, Loredana and Johanna, for the very interesting input. The topic of governance has been brought up several times, and what was kind of going through my head was the idea of the Paris Climate Agreement, and I was wondering if a similar strategy for a legally binding international agreement could be interesting for pushing agroecology across the globe, getting different trade partners to agree on the principles and implement that to kind of more support also the bottom-up movements as well through like a top-down policy.
Who wants to take that question?
I can say something on it. We have the UN Declaration on Peasant Rights. It's not making the change, and we can also look at the Paris Agreement. The change is not happening because we have the Paris Agreement, so that alone will probably not bring it. But I agree that it's very important to have governments commit to it, because then that, of course, changes the policies. Like if they subsidize mineral fertilizer, or if they subsidize organic fertilizer, for instance. So I don't know.
Loredana, you want to add?
Well, I think the idea it is surely one of the ways to go, and it's all that working in parallel. And I think this was also the idea of the coalition and of promoting agroecology at a global level. Of course, the discussions are long and it's difficult to find common agreements, but at least it makes it gives it also a different weight. If it is discussed at a global level, it also gives a different weight to the voices of farmers, because their approach sort of is discussed in high-level meetings. So even though that's a bit against the idea of agroecology that it counts more, but this is just the way it is at the moment. So I think it's surely one of the many avenues we have to go down. And I mean, now we are always talking about this governance, about the regulations, about the legal framework. I mean, what makes the real difference, as Johan also said, it's the budget. So once agroecological principles or activities are in the budgets of counties, of countries, of regions, then it really starts changing things. And of course, sometimes it's possible to take the shortcut, and sometimes you have to go the long way with all these regulations. Yeah, so I think it's necessary to keep on, but it won't be the only thing to solve.
Thank you. Indeed, also the 13 principles of the high-level panel of experts are a result of a contribution of the high-level panel of experts to the discussion in the Committee of World Food Security on agroecology. But there again, these discussions were then already at the starting point very difficult, because it was not only agroecology, it was also and other innovative approaches. So it is also in these high-level discussions to find a common ground and to agree on that as the guiding concept. That's still a long way. But the more evidence is produced also around the entire holistic understanding of agroecology, these kind of top-down discussions become also easier, I think. Allow me to close this session and thank you, Loredana and Johanna, very much for your obviously very inspiring inputs. Thank you all for being here, for the active interaction via the chat and also directly. So it was a pleasure to have you both with us, and I'm really looking forward to next session. It's only one left, but I'm sure also we will continue to provide platforms for further discussions on agroecology, and hope to see you then again. Just one information, we will continuously uploading the recordings of the earlier sessions, so check out on our website, you'll find them there too. With that, I ask all the public audiences to leave and wish you all a nice afternoon, nice evening, and ask the students enrolled in the class to stay for a last quick round with Loredana and Johanna. Thank you all very much. Have a nice evening.